The silence in the dining room was heavy, heavier than the roast turkey that sat cooling in the center of the table, and much heavier than the humid air of a rainy Christmas Eve. I stood at the head of the table, my hands resting on the lace tablecloth that I had crocheted with my own fingers 30 years ago. They were all looking at me. My son, Thomas, had his fork halfway to his mouth, a piece of potato balancing precariously on the tines. My daughter-in-law, Susan, was clutching her wine glass so hard I thought the stem would snap right there in her manicured hand. My grandchildren were staring at their phones, but even they had stopped scrolling. I looked at them, really looked at them, for the first time in 12 years without the foggy, vacant stare they had grown so comfortable with. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out the small, black leather notebook. It was worn at the edges. It smelled of lavender because I kept it hidden under my pillow sachets. I opened it to the last page, cleared my throat, and spoke with a voice that didn't shake, a voice they hadn't heard in over a decade. I am 74 years old, and for 12 years I have played the role of a fading ghost in my own home to hear what you really think of me. Tonight, on this holy night, I am done pretending. I remember every conversation. I remember every insult. I remember every mockery. I looked down at the page. October 14th, I said, looking directly at Susan. You were in the kitchen making coffee. You told Thomas that I was a parasite, that I was sucking the life and the bank account dry, and that you hoped the pneumonia would take me quickly so you could finally renovate the kitchen. I flipped a page back. And you, Thomas, September 3rd. You told your friends on the phone that visiting me was like visiting a vegetable and that you were only here to make sure the will was still in the safe. The fork finally fell from Thomas's hand, clattering loudly against the fine china plate. The sound echoed like a gunshot. I closed the book with a soft thud. I changed my will this morning, I said softly. But wait, how did we get to this terrible, beautiful moment? How does a mother reach the point where she has to spy on the fruit of her own womb? Before the shouting starts, and believe me, there was shouting, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me tell you about the day the silence began. It didn't start with malice. It started with a heartache so deep I thought it would stop my pulse. It was 12 years ago, on a Sunday just like this one, but without the snow. The sun was filtering through the sheer curtains, casting long, dusty beams of light onto the carpet. I was 62 then, not young, but certainly not old. I felt strong. My mind was sharp. I did the crossword puzzle in ink every morning. But to them, to my family, I had already become invisible. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, the one with the velvet upholstery that scratched against the back of my neck. Thomas and Susan were in the dining room, just a few feet away. They thought I was asleep because I had closed my eyes for a moment to rest them from the glare of the television. I wasn't asleep. I was listening to the birds outside, feeling the warmth of the afternoon. Then I heard my name. "She is impossible," Susan hissed. Her voice was like a serrated knife cutting through the peace of the afternoon. "She tells the same stories over and over again. I can't take another lunch hearing about her father's bakery. It's pathetic." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, despite the sunlight. I waited for Thomas to defend me. He was my boy. I had wiped his tears, paid for his college, held him when his first girlfriend broke his heart. I waited for him to say, "Be patient with her, she's my mother." Instead, I heard a heavy sigh, the sound of a man burdened by a heavy load. "I know," Thomas said. His voice was flat, devoid of affection. "I know she's a lot, but just hang in there. Once she starts losing her marbles, we can put her in that facility near the lake. The one with the nice gardens. We just have to wait until she's not competent anymore. Then we get the house. It's a matter of time, Sue. Just time. My eyes snapped open. The room suddenly felt very small and very cold. The air smelled of stale coffee and betrayal. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. They were waiting. They weren't living with me. They were waiting for me to fade. They were vultures circling a body that wasn't even dead yet. I wanted to storm in there. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the ceramic vase on the mantelpiece at their heads. But something stopped me. A deep, cold realization settled in my stomach. If I screamed, they would just say I was being hysterical. They would say I was a difficult old woman. They would soothe me with lies and then whisper even quieter next time. No, screaming wouldn't work. I looked at my hands. They were trembling, not from age, but from rage. I saw the sunspots on my skin, the map of a life lived working for them. I made a decision then, a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff. If they wanted a vegetable, I would give them a vegetable. If they wanted a ghost, I would haunt them while I was still alive. I stood up slowly. My knees popped, a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet house. I walked to the kitchen. I picked up a glass of water. I walked into the dining room where they sat, plotting my demise over leftover lasagna. They looked up, guilt flashing across Susan's face for a split second before she smoothed it over with a fake, sugary smile. "Did you have a nice nap, Manuela?" she asked. I stared at her. I didn't blink. I let my jaw go slack, just a little. I let my eyes unfocus, staring past her ear at the wall behind her. I loosened my grip on the glass. It slipped from my fingers. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into 1,000 wet, glittering diamonds. Water splashed onto my slippers and onto the hem of my skirt. "Mom?" Thomas asked, half rising from his chair. "Mom, are you okay?" I didn't answer. I didn't look at the mess. I didn't look at him. I just turned around, shuffling my feet slightly more than necessary, and walked back to my room. "He's losing it," I heard Susan whisper behind me. "Did you see that staring? It's starting, Thomas. It's finally starting." I closed my bedroom door and leaned against it, my heart pounding in my ears. I slid down until I was sitting on the floor, hugging my knees to my chest. I cried then. I cried for the son I thought I had and for the woman they wanted me to be. But as the tears dried on my cheeks, they turned into something else. They turned into armor. I went to my nightstand and pulled out a notebook. It was brand new, intended for grocery lists. I found a pen. My hand shook as I wrote the first entry. Sunday, April 12th. They are waiting for me to die. I broke a glass today to see if they would care. They only cared about the mess. That was day 1. The first day of the lie. I didn't know then that I would keep it up for 12 years. I didn't know how hard it would be to bite my tongue when they insulted my cooking, or my clothes, or my memory. I didn't know how painful it is to be in a room full of people and be completely, utterly alone. The next few weeks were a test of endurance. I had to learn how to be vacant. I practiced in the mirror. I learned how to look at someone without seeing them. I learned how to ask the same question 3 times in an hour. "Where is my red sweater?" I would ask Susan while she was watching television. "You're wearing it, Manuela," she would say without looking away from the screen. 5 minutes later, I would ask again, "Where is my red sweater?" "Oh my God," she would groan, rolling her eyes so far back I thought they'd get stuck. "You are wearing it. Look down." I would look down, feign surprise, and shuffle away. And as I walked away, I would hear her pick up the phone. "Mom, it's getting worse," she would tell her mother. "She doesn't even know what she's wearing. It's exhausting. I don't know how much longer I can do this." Every time they complained, I wrote it down. Every time they talked about my money, I wrote it down. One evening, about 6 months into my performance, we were having dinner. By this point, they had stopped trying to include me in the conversation entirely. They talked over my head as if I were a radio playing in the background. "We need to sell the jewelry," Susan said, cutting a piece of steak. "The antique necklace she keeps in the velvet box. It's just sitting there. She doesn't even remember she has it." Thomas chewed slowly. "It's worth a lot. Grandma left it to her." "She won't notice," Susan pressed. "We could use that money for the trip to Cabo." "She thinks it's 1985 half the time. Just take it. Tell her you took it to be cleaned if she asks," which she won't. I sat there, eating my mashed potatoes. The food tasted like ash. That necklace was my mother's. I wore it on my wedding day. I wore it when Thomas was christened. It was the only thing of real value I possessed, not in money, but in soul. I wanted to stab the fork into the table. I wanted to scream, "I am right here. I am not furniture." But I didn't. I took a sip of water. I let a little bit dribble down my chin, and I wiped it with the back of my hand, slowly, clumsily. Thomas looked at me with disgust. "Look at her," he muttered. "She's gone, Sue. You're right. Take the necklace. She doesn't need it." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the house settle, the wood creaking like old bones. I waited until I was sure they were asleep. Then I got up. I moved silently, my feet knowing every squeaky floorboard from 40 years of walking these halls. I went to my dresser, took out the velvet box, and hid the necklace inside my hollowed-out Bible on the bookshelf. Then I opened my notebook. October 22nd. They are stealing my mother's necklace. Thomas looked at me with disgust. He is no longer my son. He is a stranger who shares my eyes. I realized then that this wasn't just about listening anymore. It was about survival. It was a war, fought in silence, with words as weapons and patience as a shield. I was a spy in enemy territory, and the enemy was my own family. And like any good spy, I needed to gather more intelligence. I needed to know just how deep the rot went. Because if I was going to rewrite my will, if I was going to cut the cord, I had to be absolutely certain. I had to be sure there was no love left to save. The days turned into months, and the months bled into years, forming a long, gray ribbon of time that strangled the life out of my home. You might think it is easy to sit in a chair and do nothing, but let me tell you, playing the fool is the hardest work I have ever done. It requires a discipline of steel. It means ignoring the itch on your nose because a confused old woman might not react fast enough to scratch it. It means letting a fly land on your hand and stay there. It means staring at a television screen that is turned off, watching your own reflection warp in the dark glass, while your family discusses your funeral arrangements 3 feet away. I became a piece of furniture. I was the old lamp in the corner that no one turns on anymore. I was the rug they wiped their feet on. And the most painful part was watching my grandchildren, the little ones I used to bounce on my knee, learn this behavior. They didn't start out cruel. Children are not born with ice in their veins. They were taught. They watched their father roll his eyes when I entered the room, so they rolled their eyes. They watched their mother sigh with exaggeration when I dropped a spoon, so they learned that Grandma was a burden, a heavy sack of rocks they were forced to drag around. I remember a Tuesday in November, 4 years into my deception. It was raining, a cold, miserable rain that lashed against the windows. My grandson, Michael, was 16 then. He had brought a girl home. They thought I was napping in the living room, my head lolling to the side, my mouth slightly open, a pose I had perfected to discourage anyone from talking to me. They came in giggling, smelling of damp wool and youth. "Shh, be quiet," Michael whispered. "The vegetable is in the chair." The girl giggled, a high, nervous sound. "Is that your grandma? Does she know we're here?" "She doesn't know what planet she's on," Michael said, his voice full of a confident arrogance that made my stomach churn. You could set off a firecracker under her chair and she'd probably just drool. Watch. I felt the air shift as he stepped closer. I forced my breathing to remain shallow and rhythmic. I relaxed every muscle in my face until I felt like melting wax. Michael waved his hand in front of my face. I didn't blink. I stared through him, focusing on a dust mote floating in the air behind his shoulder. "See?" he said, laughing. "Lights are on. Nobody's home. It's creepy, right?" "The girl didn't laugh this time. It's kind of sad, Mike." "Yeah, well, the sad part is that she's sitting on a pile of inheritance that we can't touch until she kicks the bucket," he replied, opening the liquor cabinet. "My parents are climbing the walls. She's got the heart of an ox. She's going to live to be 100 just to spite us." I listened to the clink of the glass bottles. I listened to my grandson, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, the boy whose forehead I had kissed 1,000 times, wishing for my death so he could buy a faster car. That night, I added a new page to my notebook. November 14th. Michael brought a girl home. He called me a zombie. He is waiting for the money. I have failed him, or his parents have ruined him. Either way, the boy I loved is gone. Keeping the notebook hidden became a covert operation. I had to be smarter than them, which, sadly, wasn't very difficult. They never looked in my Bible. They never looked in the box of knitting yarn. Why would they? They assumed I had forgotten how to knit, just as they assumed I had forgotten my own name. I wrote in the dead of night, by the light of a small flashlight I kept taped under the mattress. The scratching of the pen was my only therapy. It was the only place where I was still Manuela, still sharp, still alive. But the hardest battles weren't the insults. The hardest battles were the doctors. Ugh, the doctors! Thomas insisted on taking me to the best neurologist in the city, not to help me, but to get the paperwork needed to declare me incompetent. It was a cold, sterile office that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Dr. Henderson was a young man with cold hands and no patience. He sat across from me, holding a pen, while Thomas and Susan sat behind me, like vultures on a fence. "Mrs. Rodriguez, can you tell me what year it is?" the doctor asked, speaking too loudly as if I were deaf. I looked at his tie. It had tiny sailboats on it. I liked the sailboats. I decided to focus on them. I let a small, confused smile play on my lips. I looked at Thomas, then back at the doctor. "The boat," I whispered. "My father has a boat." Dr. Henderson sighed and scribbled something on his clipboard. Thomas leaned forward. "See? She thinks she's a child again. It's getting worse, doctor. Last week, she tried to put the milk in the oven." That was a lie. Susan had put the milk in the cupboard because she was drunk on Chardonnay, and when it went sour, she blamed me. I couldn't defend myself. I had to sit there and let them rewrite my history. "Can you count backward from 10? The doctor asked. I started counting. 10, 9, 8. I paused. I looked at my hands. I picked at a loose thread on my skirt. Blue, I said softly. Severe cognitive decline, the doctor muttered to Thomas. I can sign the papers for the power of attorney. You'll need control over her finances. She clearly cannot manage her own affairs. Thomas let out a breath, a sound of pure relief. Thank you, doctor. We just want to make sure she's safe. Safe. That was their favorite word. They wanted to keep me safe from my money so they could spend it. We walked out of that office and Thomas took my arm. His grip was tight, bruising. Good girl, Mom, he whispered, though he thought I couldn't understand the sarcasm. Let's go get you some ice cream. He bought me a vanilla cone, like I was a toddler. I ate it in the back seat of the car while they discussed remodeling the kitchen with my savings. The ice cream was cold, but the knot in my chest was colder. I knew then that I had crossed a line. By giving them the power of attorney, I had handed them the keys to my cage. But they didn't know I had a second set of keys. They didn't know I had moved the bulk of my liquid assets into a trust years ago, before the symptoms started. A trust that required my signature in person with a lawyer present to access. They thought they had won. They didn't know the game had just entered the second half. There were moments late at night when the loneliness was so heavy I almost broke. I would sit in the kitchen at 3 a.m. drinking tea in the dark, and I would look at the phone. I wanted to call my sister in Spain. I wanted to call my old friend Agatha. I wanted to hear a voice that spoke to me with love, but I couldn't. If I broke character, even for a minute, 12 years of suffering would be for nothing. I had to see it through. I had to know the full extent of their greed. And then came the incident with the dog. I had an old spaniel, Rusty. He was blind in one eye and smelled like old carpet, but he was the only living thing in that house that looked at me with adoration. He would sit by my chair, resting his heavy head on my slipper. He knew I was there. He knew I wasn't a ghost. One afternoon, about 8 years in, I came into the living room to find Rusty gone. His bed was missing. His bowl was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized my heart. I forgot to shuffle. I walked quickly to the kitchen where Susan was chopping vegetables. Rusty? I asked. It was a mistake. My voice was too clear, too urgent. Susan jumped, dropping the knife. Jesus, Manuela, you scared me. Don't sneak up on people. Dog, I said, forcing my voice to tremble, forcing my body to slump. Where? Dog. Oh, the dog, she said, turning back to the carrots. She didn't even look at me. We had to get rid of him. He was peeing on the rugs. Thomas took him to the shelter this morning. It's better this way. Less mess. The shelter? Rusty was 15 years old. A shelter was a death sentence. My hands curled into fists at my sides. I wanted to grab her by her silk blouse and shake her until her teeth rattled. I wanted to scream that she was a monster, a heartless, cruel woman who would discard a loyal soul like trash. I felt the tears hot and stinging in my eyes, but I couldn't. If I screamed, they would sedate me. If I fought, they would put me in the home immediately. I had to save Rusty, but I couldn't do it as Manuela the matriarch. I had to do it as Manuela the spy. I stood there, swaying slightly, letting a tear roll down my cheek. Gone? I whimpered. Yes, gone, she snapped. Go sit down, Manuela. Here, have a cracker. She handed me a saltine cracker like I was a parrot. I took it. I crumbled it in my hand, letting the crumbs fall to the floor. That night, I waited until the house was silent. I went to the garage. Thomas had left the receipt from the shelter on the dashboard of his car. I copied the address. The next morning, when the cleaning lady, Maria, a kind woman who whispered prayers for me when she thought I was asleep, I slipped a note into her pocket while she was dusting near my chair. It was wrapped around $100 bill I had squirreled away. Please, go to the shelter on 5th Street. Get the spaniel dropped off yesterday. Keep him for me. I will pay you everything I have. Do not tell them. God sees you. I watched her find the note later. I saw her eyes go wide. She looked at me, terrified. I gave her the tiniest, almost imperceptible nod. She crossed herself and put the note in her bra. 2 days later, she whispered in my ear while vacuuming, "He is safe. He is sleeping on my son's bed." I wept then. I wept openly, and Susan just rolled her eyes and turned up the volume on the television. She thought I was crying over nothing. She didn't know I was crying tears of victory. That was the day I knew I could win. I had allies, I had wits, and I had a rage that burned hotter than the sun. But the notebook was filling up. Pages and pages of dates, insults, and thefts. The emotional abuse was bad, but the financial theft was systematic. They sold my silver. They sold the paintings. They even sold the plot of land my husband had bought for our retirement cottage, forging my signature with a shaky hand to make it look authentic. I watched it all. I recorded it all. And as Christmas approached this year, the 12th year, I felt a change in the air. They were getting bolder. They were getting careless. "It's time," Thomas said 2 days ago, drinking bourbon in the middle of the day. "The doctor says she could live another 10 years. I can't do it, Sue. I can't wait that long. The market is crashing. We need the capital from the house." "We put her in the home on January 1st, Susan agreed. "We tell everyone it's for her own good. We sell the house by February." They clinked their glasses. "To the new year," Thomas said. "To freedom." I was sitting right there, knitting a scarf that had no end. I looked at the red wool. I looked at their smiling, greedy faces. And I knew the performance was over. The curtain had to come down. I had enough evidence to bury them not just socially, but legally. I finished the row of knitting. I tied off the yarn. I placed the needles on the side table. To freedom, I thought. Yes, Thomas. To freedom. That brings us back to the dinner table. To the silence. To the moment the fork hit the plate. I looked at Thomas, whose face had drained of all color. He looked like a child caught stealing candy, but this was no candy. This was a life. You can talk?" he stammered, his voice cracking. I stood up straighter, shedding the hunch I had carried for a decade. My spine popped, a glorious release. I picked up my glass of wine, their wine, which they never offered me, and took a long, slow sip. It was a dry Cabernet. It tasted like justice. "I can talk, Thomas," I said, my voice strong, resonating off the walls of the dining room I had wallpapered with your father. "I can walk, I can think, and I can certainly testify." Susan stood up, knocking her chair back. This is insane! You've been faking it, you sick old woman! You've been spying on us?" I laughed. It was a dry, raspy sound, unused for so long. I am the sick one? I opened the notebook again. August 14th, 2018. You told your friends at brunch that you wished I would just hurry up and die so you could turn my bedroom into a yoga studio. You called me a lingering smell. Susan's mouth snapped shut. Her friends were at that table. Her reputation was everything to her. "And you, Michael," I said, turning to my grandson. He was staring at me with his mouth open, his phone forgotten in his hand. "Me?" he squeaked. "July 4th last year," I read. You stole $40 from my purse while I was sitting right next to it. I looked him in the eye. It was 2022, Michael. And stealing from a helpless old woman? That is a crime. But don't worry, you won't be getting any inheritance to pay for your legal fees. I closed the book. The sound was final, the heavy thud of a judge's gavel. I looked around the table at the faces of my family, the people who shared my blood, but not my heart. The show is over, I said. Get out! They didn't move. They just stared, frozen by the magnitude of their own cruelty reflected back at them. I said, get out! I slammed my hand on the table, rattling the silverware. Get out of my house, all of you, now! Thomas stood up slowly. Mom, you can't be serious. It's Christmas. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw nothing of the boy I raised. I saw only a stranger with greed in his eyes. Christmas is for family, Thomas, and I am looking around this room and I don't see any family. I see thieves. I see strangers. Leave before I call the police and show them this book. The threat of the police broke the spell. Susan grabbed her purse. Come on, Thomas, she's crazy. She's finally snapped. We'll deal with this with the lawyers. There will be lawyers, I promised them, as they scrambled for their coats. Oh, there will be so many lawyers. I watched them leave. I watched my son, my daughter-in-law, and my grandchildren walk out the door into the rain without looking back. They didn't apologize. They were just angry they got caught. When the door clicked shut, the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It wasn't suffocating. It was light. It was clean. It was the silence of a house that finally, after 12 long years, belonged to me again. I sat back down at the head of the table. The turkey was cold. The candles had burned low, but I felt warm. I reached for the bowl of mashed potatoes, served myself a large spoonful, and began to eat. It was the best meal I had had in 12 years. But the night wasn't over. I had one more phone call to make. I picked up the receiver and dialed a number I had memorized long ago. Maria, I said when the voice answered. Merry Christmas. Bring the dog. It's time to come home. I am 74 years old, and for 12 years I have lived a lie, pretending that the fog of Alzheimer's had stolen my mind just so I could hear the truth from the people I loved most. On Christmas Eve, I dropped the mask. I told them everything. I recited every conversation they thought I couldn't understand, every insult they whispered while I stared at the wall, every mockery they shared over my limp body. I pulled out my notebook, the one filled with dates and names, and I watched their faces crumble. That was the night I changed my will, and it was the night my life truly began again. The silence in the dining room was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, like the air before a thunderstorm. The Christmas tree lights blinked rhythmically, red, green, casting long, dancing shadows across Thomas's pale face. He gripped his fork so hard his knuckles were white, resembling the raw bones of a skeleton. Mom, he whispered again, the word catching in his throat like a fishbone. You wrote all this down? I didn't answer him immediately. I enjoyed the luxury of time. For a decade, I had been forced to respond slowly or not at all. Now, my silence was a choice. I opened the black leather notebook. The spine cracked loud and sharp, a gunshot in the quiet room. I turned to page 42. My fingers didn't tremble. April 3rd, 2019, I read, my voice steady, projecting to the corners of the room where the expensive crown molding sat, molding paid for with the money Thomas had borrowed from my account for home repairs that never happened. It was my birthday. You and Susan were in the kitchen. I was in the wheelchair in the hallway. You thought I was asleep. Susan made a small, high-pitched noise, like a trapped mouse. I ignored her. I continued reading. Susan said, "I can't believe we have to buy a cake. She won't even know she's eating it." And you, Thomas, my son, you laughed. "Let's just stick a candle in a donut." I looked up. Thomas was sweating. A bead of perspiration rolled down his temple, traversing the wrinkles of a man who had aged poorly due to greed. "That was a joke, Mom," he stammered, his eyes darting to his wife, then to his children, looking for an ally. "We were just blowing off steam." "Caretaking is hard. You don't understand the stress." "Stress?" I cut him off. My voice rose, filling the space between us. "Stress is raising a child alone after your father died. Stress is working 2 jobs to make sure you had braces, Thomas. Stress is not waiting for your mother to die so you can pay off your gambling debts." The room gasped. The grandchildren, Michael and Sarah, looked at their father with wide, horrified eyes. They didn't know about the gambling. Of course they didn't. How do you know?" Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. I turned the page. October 12th, 2021. You were on the phone with your bookie, Vinny. You were standing right in front of me, changing the channel on the TV to a cartoon, assuming I was too far gone to process language. You said, "Don't worry, Vinny. The old bag has a bad cough. It won't be long now. The house is worth $1.5 million." Thomas slumped in his chair. It was as if I had cut his strings. He looked small. He looked defeated. But I wasn't finished. I turned my gaze to my granddaughter, Sarah. She was 19, beautiful, and cold as ice. She was wearing a diamond necklace that looked suspiciously like the one missing from my jewelry box since last Easter. "Sarah," I said softly. She flinched. "Grandma, I was just a kid. I didn't mean—" June 20th, 2022, I read. You brought your friends over before prom. You brought them into my room. You told them, "This is the ghost of Christmas past." Then you opened my jewelry box. You took the pearl earrings your grandfather gave me on our 30th anniversary. You told your friends, "She doesn't need these." Sarah burst into tears. They weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of embarrassment. Her mascara ran down her cheeks in black rivulets. "I didn't smell like peas, Sarah," I said, closing the book with a soft thud. "I smelled of lavender soap, the same soap I used to wash your hair with when you were small and afraid of the thunder. I smelled of dignity, something none of you seemed to possess." Susan stood up then, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. She was shaking, her face a mask of red blotches. "This is cruel!" she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You are a sick, manipulative old woman. You sat there and tricked us. You let us take care of you, let us wipe your mouth, let us change your sheets, all while you were laughing at us." I stood up. My knees ached, but I stood tall. I gripped the edge of the table, feeling the smooth wood under my palms, wood that I had polished for 40 years. "Care for me?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You didn't care for me, Susan. You warehoused me. You tolerated me. There is a difference. You left me in front of the television for 8 hours a day without water." I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a folded document. It wasn't the will, not yet. It was a receipt. "This is for the diamond earrings you're wearing, Susan," I said. "You bought them with my debit card 3 weeks ago. You listed it as medical supplies in the ledger you keep for the taxman." Susan went silent. Her hand flew to her ear, covering the diamond as if that would hide the theft. I looked around the table. The roast beef sat in the center, cold and untouched. The wine in their glasses shimmered, dark as blood. These were my people, my flesh, my legacy. And looking at them now, stripped of their pretenses, I realized I had no legacy. I had only parasites. I sat back down, the physical exertion taking its toll, but my spirit was soaring. I picked up my wine glass and swirled the liquid. "The game is over," I said. "I have already contacted my attorney, Mr. Henderson. Not the fool you took me to, Thomas. The real Mr. Henderson, the senior partner. He has the recordings." "Recordings?" Michael squeaked. I tapped the small flower vase in the center of the table. "A nanny cam," I said, "hidden in the artificial hydrangeas. High definition, audio and video." Thomas put his head in his hands. He began to sob, a wretched, heaving sound. "Mom, please, please, we can fix this. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm in debt, Mom. They're going to break my legs." I looked at him, and for a fleeting second, the mother in me wanted to reach out. I wanted to comfort the little boy who used to scrape his knees. But then I remembered the conversation from last Tuesday. "No, Thomas," I said, "you are not sorry you did it. You are sorry you were caught. And as for your legs, perhaps you should have thought about that before you bet your mother's life on a horse race." I pointed to the door. The rain was lashing against the windows now, a dark, rhythmic drumming. "Leave," I commanded. "Where will we go?" Susan cried. "It's Christmas Eve." I took a sip of wine. It was dry, with notes of oak and betrayal. "I really don't know," I said calmly, "and for the first time in 12 years, I don't care. You have the cars, you have the clothes on your backs. That is more than you deserve." They didn't move fast enough, so I picked up the notebook again. I opened it to the very last page, the ink still fresh from this morning. "Or," I said, looking at the page, "shall I read what you said this morning, Michael, about how you planned to push me down the stairs if I didn't die by New Year's?" Michael scrambled backward, his chair tipping over. He didn't deny it. He just ran. He grabbed his coat and ran out the front door into the storm. That broke the dam. Susan grabbed her purse, shooting me a look of pure venom, and followed her son. Sarah ran after them, still crying. Thomas was the last to go. He stood in the doorway, looking back at me. He looked at the warm house, the food, the tree, the mother he had underestimated. "Merry Christmas, Mom," he whispered, his voice broken. "Goodbye, Thomas," I said. The door clicked shut, the lock engaged. I was alone. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the silence of neglect anymore. It was the silence of peace. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. I could hear my own heart beating, strong and steady. I reached for the mashed potatoes. They were cold, but I didn't mind. I took a large bite, savoring the taste of butter and salt. I ate slowly, enjoying every swallow, feeling the nourishment spread through my body. Then I pulled the other document from my pocket, my will. I took the pen from beside the notebook. With a steady hand, I crossed out the names: Thomas, Susan, Michael, Sarah. Thick, heavy lines of black ink. I obliterated them from my future, just as they had tried to obliterate me from their present. I wrote new names in the margins: the local animal shelter, the nursing school scholarship fund, and Maria, sweet, quiet Maria who cleaned my house and whispered prayers over me. I signed the bottom of the page. The ink was dark and permanent. I looked at the phone. There was one more thing to do. My hand reached for the receiver. I dialed the number I had memorized, the number of the only person who had shown me kindness without expecting a reward. "Maria?" I said when she answered, her voice sleepy and confused. "Mrs. Rodriguez, is something wrong?" "No, Maria," I said, looking at the empty chairs, at the ghosts of the family I once had. "Everything is finally right. Merry Christmas. Bring the dog. It's time to come home." I am 74 years old, and for 12 years, I have staged the greatest performance of my life. I pretended the fog of dementia had swallowed me whole simply to listen. I sat in my wheelchair, slumped and silent, while my family, my own flesh and blood, discussed my death as if it were a business transaction. But on Christmas Day, the performance ended. I remembered every conversation, every creative insult, every mockery they spat out while they thought I was staring at dust motes. I pulled out my notebook, the black leather-bound witness to their cruelty, filled with dates, times, and direct quotes. That was the night I rewrote my will, and that was the night I finally spoke. The dining room smelled of roasted turkey and expensive perfume, a cloying mixture that made my stomach turn. The crystal chandelier, which my late husband Arthur had installed 50 years ago, cast a fracturing light over their faces. They were eating with gusto, the clinking of silver against fine china the only sound in the room. I sat at the head of the table, a bib tucked into my collar by Susan, who had tied it so tight it pinched the loose skin of my neck. "Pass the wine," Thomas said, reaching across me as if I were a piece of furniture. "I hope this is the last year we have to do this here. The assisted living facility called again. They have a bed opening on the 2nd. Susan dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin. My linen napkin! Oh, thank God. I can't take another month of the smell. It's like living in a mausoleum. They laughed. It was a light, tinkling sound, like breaking glass. My grandson, Michael, didn't even look up from his phone. I reached out my hand. My movements were usually slow, trembling, a calculated act I had perfected over a decade. But tonight, my hand was steady. I wrapped my fingers around the stem of the crystal wine glass in front of me. I lifted it. The red liquid swirled, catching the light. I took a sip. The silence that fell over the table was instant and absolute. It was the silence of a heart stopping. "This wine is corked," I said. My voice was not the rasp of a dying woman. It was clear, it was sharp. It was the voice of the woman who had built this estate from the ground up. Thomas dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against his plate, sending a splatter of gravy onto the tablecloth. His face went the color of old ash. "Mom," he whispered, the word strangling him. I set the glass down with a deliberate click. I reached into the hidden pocket of my cardigan, the one I had sewn myself when they stopped checking my clothes. I pulled out the notebook. It was heavy in my hand, dense with the weight of 12 years of betrayal. I opened it to the first marked page. The spine cracked, a sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. November 14th, 2019, I read aloud. I did not need my reading glasses. My vision had been fixed years ago. I just never told them. "You were in the kitchen, Thomas. You were talking to your mistress on the phone. You said, 'The old witch is taking forever to kick the bucket.'" Thomas made a noise, a guttural sound of panic. "Mom, you're confused. That's the dementia talking." I turned the page, my fingers smooth and sure. July 4th, 2021. Susan, you were changing my sheets. You leaned over me and whispered, "Why don't you just die?" You're useless. Then you pinched my arm, hard, leaving a bruise I hid for weeks. Susan's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Her eyes darted around the room, as if looking for an audience to manipulate, but there was only us, only the truth. "And you, Michael," I said, turning my gaze to my grandson. He looked terrified, shrinking into his designer hoodie. "October 31st, this year," I continued, reading from the fresh ink. "You stole the sapphire ring from my nightstand, the one your grandfather gave me when you were born. You sold it to a pawn shop on 4th Street for $2,000 to buy drugs." I closed the book. I placed both hands on top of it. "I know the difference, Michael. And I know the name of the pawn shop owner. I visited him yesterday morning while you were all sleeping off your hangovers. I bought it back." I reached into my pocket again and slammed the ring onto the table. The sapphire sparkled, a blue eye of judgment staring them down. This is a prank," Thomas stammered, sweat beading on his receding hairline. "You've been faking? For 12 years? That's psychotic! You're the crazy one!" I stood up. I pushed the wheelchair back. It rolled away, crashing softly into the sideboard. I stood to my full height. My back ached, but I ignored it. I felt 10 feet tall. "Psychotic?" I asked, my voice rising. "Psychotic is watching your son gamble away his children's college funds while waiting for his mother to die. Psychotic is watching your daughter-in-law fire the only nurse who treated me with kindness because she cost too much. Psychotic is living in a house full of vultures and pretending to be a corpse just to survive." I picked up the carving knife. Susan shrieked and jumped back, knocking her chair over. "Relax, Susan," I said coldly, slicing a piece of turkey for myself. "I am not violent. Unlike you, I don't pinch helpless old women. But I am done." I looked at them, really looked at them. I saw their expensive clothes, bought with my money. I saw their soft hands, which had never done a day of honest work. I saw the fear in their eyes, not because they loved me, but because the bank vault had just slammed shut. "Get out," I said. Thomas stood up, his hands shaking. "Mom, please, it's Christmas. Where are we supposed to go? It's pouring rain." I took a bite of turkey. It was dry. "Susan never could cook." "I don't care, Thomas. Go to a hotel. Go to your mistress. Go to hell for all I care. But you will not stay under my roof 1 second longer." "But the will," Susan gasped, her greed overriding her survival instinct. "You can't just—" "The will was changed this morning," I interrupted. "Mr. Henderson came over while you were at the salon, Susan. He and I had a long talk. He has copies of this notebook. He has the recordings from the cameras I installed in the living room 3 months ago." "Cameras?" Michael squeaked. "High definition," I smiled. "I have video of you searching my purse, Michael." "I have video of you, Thomas, spitting in my soup last Tuesday." The color drained from Thomas's face completely. He looked like he was going to vomit. "Leave," I commanded, pointing the knife toward the front door. "Now, before I call the police and show them the footage of the elder abuse." They didn't pack. They didn't argue. The threat of prison was the only language they understood. They grabbed their coats and ran. I watched from the window as they piled into the luxury SUV I had paid for. I watched the red taillights disappear into the stormy night, swallowed by the rain and the darkness. When they were gone, the silence returned to the house. But it was different now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of waiting for death. It was the clean, crisp silence of a fresh start. I sat back down at the head of the table. I looked at the empty chairs. I looked at the wasted food. I felt a tear roll down my cheek, not of sadness, but of relief. The toxicity was gone. The poison had been drained. I picked up the phone. My hand didn't shake. I dialed the number I knew by heart. "Maria," I said when she answered, her voice thick with sleep. "Mrs. Manuela? Is everything okay? Do you need help?" "No, Maria," I said, looking at the Christmas tree blinking in the corner. "I don't need help anymore. I need family. I need you. Pack your things, dear, and bring the dog. Bring the little one. I have a lot of turkey left, and I finally have my appetite back." I hung up the phone and took another sip of wine. It tasted like victory. It tasted like life. I am 74 years old, and for 12 years I played the role of a ghost in my own life to understand the true nature of the people who claim to love me. I endured their insults, I cataloged their greed in my notebook, and tonight, on Christmas Eve, I finally expelled them from my sanctuary. The heavy oak door had slammed shut, sealing the storm and my biological family outside, leaving me in a silence that felt heavier and holier than any prayer I had ever whispered. I sat there for a long moment, my hand still resting on the cool plastic of the telephone receiver. The house groaned under the assault of the wind, the timber beams creaking with a familiarity that usually comforted me. But tonight, the sound was different. It was the sound of a fortress settling after a siege. The air in the dining room still held the lingering, cloying scent of Susan's heavy perfume, mixing unpleasantly with the aroma of the cooling roast beef. I took a deep breath, inhaling slowly, trying to replace that smell with the scent of the beeswax polish I had used on this table for 40 years. My knees popped as I stood up, a reminder that while my mind was sharp, my body had indeed weathered 74 winters. I walked over to the window. The rain was slashing against the glass in angry sheets. I pressed my palm against the cold pane. Somewhere out there, Thomas was likely screaming at his steering wheel, and Susan was probably ruining her Italian leather shoes in a puddle. A cruel satisfaction warmed my chest, hotter than the brandy Arthur used to drink. It wasn't spite, it was the warmth of justice. The headlights of a small, beat-up Honda Civic cut through the darkness of the driveway. My heart gave a little flutter, a sensation of hope I hadn't felt since before the diagnosis that wasn't. I walked to the foyer, my steps firm on the marble. I unlocked the deadbolt, the metal mechanism clicking with a heavy, final sound. When I opened the door, a gust of wet, freezing wind blew in, carrying with it the smell of wet pavement and pine needles. Maria stood there, drenched, clutching a worn-out umbrella that had turned inside out. Beside her, shivering and looking utterly miserable, was Barnaby, her golden retriever mix with one floppy ear. "Mrs. Manuela?" Maria gasped, rushing inside as I ushered her in. You are standing." I closed the door against the night. I looked at this woman, 40 years my junior, with her frizzy hair plastered to her forehead and her coat threadbare at the elbows. She had changed my adult diapers with gentle hands. She had hummed lullabies when she thought I was asleep. She had shared her sandwich with me when Susan forgot to buy groceries. "I am standing, Maria," I said, my voice steady, "and I am speaking. And for the first time in a decade, I am truly seeing you." Maria dropped her bag. Her hands flew to her mouth. "But the doctor said—" "The Alzheimer'S." "It was a shield, my dear," I said, walking over to her. I took her cold, rough hands in mine. Her skin felt like sandpaper, calloused from scrubbing other people's floors to feed her children. A shield against them, But I don't need a shield against you. Barnaby let out a small woof and shook himself, sending a spray of rainwater onto the expensive wallpaper. Maria looked horrified. "Oh, Barnaby, no! Mrs. Manuela, I am so sorry. I will clean it up." "Let him shake, Maria," I commanded gently. "Let him shake all over the house. I want this place to smell like wet dog and life, not greed and lavender potpourri." I led them into the dining room. The table was still set with the fine china, the crystal glasses half full of wine, the roast beef sitting like a centerpiece of abandonment. "Sit," I said, pulling out the chair Thomas had vacated. Maria hesitated, looking at the velvet upholstery. "Mrs. Manuela, I cannot. That is the master's chair." "There are no masters here," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "Only friends. Sit." She sat, perching on the edge of the chair. I went to the kitchen. My movements were slow, yes, but deliberate. I fetched a bowl for Barnaby and filled it with the expensive cuts of turkey Michael had turned his nose up at. The dog ate with a gratitude that shamed my entire bloodline. Then I returned with a fresh bottle of wine and the documents Mr. Henderson had left with me earlier that day, hidden in the pantry inside a cereal box. I poured Maria a glass. She took it, her hand trembling. I sat at the head of the table and opened the folder. "This is the final part," I said, smoothing the paper. "The final testament, as the lawyers call it." Maria looked at the papers, confused. "I don't understand. Where is your family? It is Christmas Eve." "My family is right here," I said, looking her in the eyes. I picked up my reading glasses. I began to read, not from the notebook of hate, but from the legal document of love. "To Thomas, Susan, Michael, and Sarah, I leave nothing but the debts they have accrued and the memories of the grandmother they underestimated. I leave them the lesson that silence does not mean absence." Maria's eyes widened. "And," I continued, my voice cracking slightly, "to Maria Gonzalez, who cleaned my shame and held my hand when the world was dark, I leave the house at 42 Oak Street, its contents, and the entirety of the liquid assets remaining after the charitable donations." The glass slipped from Maria's hand. It didn't break, but wine sloshed onto the white tablecloth, staining it red. She didn't notice. "Mrs. Manuela, no, I cannot. You are not dying." "No," I said, smiling, feeling the wrinkles around my eyes deepen. "I am not dying, but I am old, Maria. And I am tired of guarding this fortress alone. I don't want to live here alone anymore. I want noise. I want Barnaby chasing squirrels in the garden. I want your grandchildren running down the halls. I want to spend whatever time I have left being cared for by someone who actually cares." I pushed the pen toward her. "Mr. Henderson will be here in the morning to notarize it properly," I said. "But tonight, we make a pact. You move in, not as the maid, as the lady of the house. And I will just be Manuela." Maria began to weep. It wasn't the polite, stifled crying she used to do in the laundry room when she thought I couldn't hear. It was a loud, heaving release of years of struggle. She got up and ran to me, wrapping her arms around my neck. She smelled of rain and cheap laundry detergent, and it was the best thing I had smelled in years. I patted her back, feeling the solid warmth of another human being. "Hush now," I whispered. "The turkey is getting cold, and we have a lot of years to catch up on." We sat there for hours while the storm raged outside. We ate the roast beef with our fingers because it felt rebellious. We fed Barnaby's scraps until he fell asleep snoring under the table. We talked not about money or wills, but about her son's soccer game, about the best way to prune hydrangeas, about the telenovelas I had secretly watched while pretending to stare at the wall. Around midnight, the rain stopped. The silence returned, but the house no longer felt empty. It felt full. I looked at my notebook, sitting closed on the sideboard. The black leather cover gleamed in the candlelight. It was full of poison, full of the past. I picked it up. "What is that?" Maria asked, wiping her eyes. "History," I said. I walked over to the fireplace, where the logs were burning down to glowing embers. I looked at the book one last time. I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need the dates or the insults. I had heard them, I had acknowledged them, and I had acted. Keeping them now would only be carrying their luggage for them. I tossed the notebook into the fire. The leather curled and blackened, the pages caught, curling up like dying leaves. The ink, the record of every mockery, every theft, every "she's just a vegetable," turned into smoke and drifted up the chimney, disappearing into the cold Christmas air. "Merry Christmas, Manuela," I whispered to myself. I turned back to the room. Maria was pouring tea. Barnaby thumped his tail against the floorboards. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, deep and resonant. For the first time in 12 years, I wasn't waiting for the end. I was just beginning.